Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our meeting this morning on net zero decarbonizing agriculture. My name is Kevin Fenwick. I'm one of the executives in residence at the Johnson Shama Graduate School of Public Policy. More important for me for this morning's meeting, I'm a Saskatchewan farm boy. I'm actually talking to you from the farm that my wife and I own, which used to belong to my grandparents. So anything to do with agriculture is near and dear to my heart, and this is certainly a topic that falls within that category. Welcome, everyone. And for those that don't know, Johnson Shama Graduate School of Public Policy, known also as JSGS or just JS or JOSHO, which is what a number of people refer to us as, is a provincial center for advanced study and research in public policy administration. We're a partnership between the University of Regina and the University of Saskatchewan, based on the spirit of cooperation and collaboration that defines Saskatchewan, and that history of cooperation in Saskatchewan is certainly no more evident than in agriculture. I live not too far from where the Territorial Grain Growers Association got its start. Since we started in 2007, Johnson Shama has become one of Canada's leading policy schools for educating grad students and public servants interested in and devoted to advancing public value. I want to acknowledge at this time that while today's event is taking place online, Johnson Shama's physical home is located on both Treaty 4 and Treaty 6 territories and the traditional home of the Métis. We're talking about my neighbors here. I live just about a mile actually from Papikasas First Nation, so this is an important acknowledgement for me and for all of us. To help the event run smoothly, we ask that all of you stay muted and turn off your video. It helps with bandwidth and probably makes the presentation better for you as well. We'll monitor the chat, and what we'd ask you to do is put any questions you have in the chat, and I'll be able to read them out to the group. Feel free to turn your videos back on for the question and answer period, however. And the other thing is, although we're doing this virtually and many of you are working from home, we have a very strict dress code for these sessions. We insist that you all have your cleanest pair of sweatpants on today if you're working from home. The format for today's event is as follows. Our speakers will each present for approximately 10 minutes. Following that, we will entertain questions from you, the most important people who are here today. As I mentioned, put your questions in the chat if you would, and we'll make sure that they get, as much as time allows, presented to our very knowledgeable guest speakers. If you have any logistical or technical questions, our technical whiz is Karen, who's sent you the first chat message in the chat room, and you can let Karen know if you've got a problem, and she'll work her usual magic. We would note, as you probably already have been notified verbally, this is being recorded, and the session will be made available in the future for rewatching, or you can share it with your friends and neighbors if you like. With the formalities out of the way, I'm very pleased to introduce to you today's speakers, and I'll introduce all three of them now and in the order that they will be presenting to you. First, Ymène Fouli is an environmental soil scientist and an independent consultant. She grew up in Tunisia, where she studied geology and environmental engineering, and later attended a graduate school in Scotland and in the United States, where she taught and conducted research in soil science. Ymène continued with research in nutrient management and animal farming in Maryland and Saskatchewan, later joining a consulting firm in Alberta as an environmental scientist and project manager. She currently consults independently on water and soil quality, watershed management, and climate change. Our second speaker this morning will be Richard Krobel, research scientist with AAFC Lethbridge. Roland hails from Germany and has a BSc in organic farming. He switched direction to environmental systems analysis for his master's, only to return to agriculture with his PhD, which focused on simulating greenhouse gas emissions. Since then, Roland is leading the Holos Model Science Program, a software application that was developed for Canadian farmers to test the influence of their management choices on their farm's greenhouse gas budget. And thirdly, Margot Hurlbert, Canada Research Chair in Climate Change, Energy and Sustainability Policy, and a professor at Johnson Shama. Margot's research focuses on governance and climate change, energy and water, interrogating laws, policies, and practices that will address both the problem of climate change and adaptation and mitigation to the changing climate. She has participated in and led research projects focusing on aspects of governance, including energy, water, agricultural producer livelihoods, drought, and flood. Margot also serves as a coordinating author, contributing author, and review editor for the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change. We're looking forward to an entertaining and engaging discussion, and so I will turn the floor over to our first presenter, who'll probably take about 30 seconds to get her PowerPoint loaded. Ymène, the baton is passed to you.
Thank you so much, Kevin. I will try and share my slides here. So I hope they're visible to everybody. So thank you so much for this opportunity to present, to be a part of such an important conversation. So thanks to the U of R Shoyo Center, and I just wanted to present the current status quo with Canadian agriculture, where are we at, and with our emissions, and what will it take to reach net zero for Canadian agriculture. So I'll just go over the outline. To start with, I'd like to go over the current data with an intro on greenhouse gas effect before presenting emissions in Canada and current greenhouse gas emissions from Canadian agriculture. So I'll go over briefly livestock production emissions and crop production. And this will give us a basis to look into where the efforts can be made to decarbonize Canadian agriculture. And then I'll pass it on to Dr. Krobel, who will introduce methodologies for estimating emissions from Canadian agriculture. And then Dr. Hurlbert will introduce policies and measures to reduce emissions. So first, here's a figure showing natural versus human enhanced greenhouse effect. So greenhouse gases absorb and emit infrared radiation, and they cause warming of the planet's surface. And we need this warming to survive. It's vital for life, but too much of this warming will cause temperatures to rise and will cause changes in atmospheric energy and rates of evaporation. And so then we'll get unpredictable weather patterns, as we've seen in many parts of the world, heat waves and intense and frequent droughts or wildfires like we've seen in Alberta, intense precipitation events and floods, etc. So we also get a change in ocean productivity, and then we get species at sea and at land that risk extinction or relocation. And then we have desertification issues and land degradation. And with a growing population, we have food security issues. And so it's really a big crisis that we need to tackle. So anyway, the main greenhouse gases, as you see here, are carbon dioxide, CO2, methane, CH4, and nitrous oxide, N2O, and then also ozone. These gases have different radiative forces and different global warming potentials. And so in order to compare them and to add them to each other, we have to standardize the units. And so we use carbon dioxide equivalent, CO2 equivalent, by converting the amounts of other gases to the equivalent of the amount of carbon dioxide with the same global warming potential over a 100-year time horizon. So for example, to be consistent with the Canadian National Inventory Report and the IPCC assessment reports, in this case, the fourth assessment report, methane has a global warming potential of 25. So emitting a ton of methane is equivalent to emitting 25 tons of CO2 into the atmosphere. And so with nitrous oxide, it's actually 298. So emitting a ton of nitrous oxide is equivalent to emitting 298 tons of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. These values are adjusted on a regular basis, and in order to capture changes in the atmospheric conditions and in gas concentrations. my next slide is not moving. Here we go. So in Canada, total emissions amount to about 729 megatons of CO2 equivalent. About 80% of them are emitted in the form of CO2. And then we have methane emissions, and they consist mainly of fugitive emissions generated by oil and natural gas systems, or coal mining, agriculture, animal waste management systems, and landfills and wastewater. And then we have nitrous oxide emissions that result mainly from agricultural soil management, energy and fuel combustion, industrial processes, and waste management. And then when we look at the breakdown by sector, the majority of greenhouse gas emissions in Canada are produced by oil and gas, transportation, buildings, heavy industry, and electricity. And then we have about 10% that's produced by agricultural sector. Agriculture is a major industry and a key driver of the Canadian economy, and it's at high risk from the effects of climate change. So really left unchecked, it will deepen the income crisis on Canadian farms as farmers struggle to deal with unpredictability in the weather, continued warming, intense storms, etc. And so there's really an urgent adaptation response needed to meet the demands of our population. And then, of course, mitigation measures are also required in all climate change response plans. So here, agriculture covers about 5% of Canada's landmass, and about 80% of the agricultural land is located in the prairie provinces, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta. And as you see here, this map shows eco-zones that are farmed across the country, and about 75% of the prairies are farmed. And you got major agricultural land uses include cultivated lands, about 37, almost 38 million hectares, grasslands, 19 million hectares, and the main crops include grain crops, oilseeds, pulses, and forage crops. And then, of course, livestock production is big. And so we have about 12.5 million cattle, almost a million dairy cows, 14 million pigs, 145.5 million hens and chickens, and then also 1 million sheep and lambs. And so emissions result mainly from losses in production processes, like during animal digestion or manure management, and also from agricultural soils. So this figure shows and that emissions have increased since 1990 from about 45 megatons of CO2 equivalent to 59 megatons in 2018. And that's about 8% of total greenhouse gas emissions in Canada. But this doesn't include energy sources, so like production processes, transportation, and fugitive emissions during production of nitrogen fertilizers, for example. So if we add these, agriculture will contribute about 12% of total greenhouse gas emissions in Canada. So here we can see that what the main gases are. We see that nitrous oxide and methane are pretty big, as you see in the central pie chart. Carbon dioxide also is emitted from soils and from the use of fossil fuels and machinery, farm transportation, electricity, and heating needs. CO2 emissions account for about 26%. Nitrous oxides account for about 36% of agricultural emissions, and they're mainly through agricultural, direct through release from soils and manure management. And then methane emissions account for about 38%, and they're mainly from enteric fermentation and manure management. Enteric fermentation is the digestive process that breaks down carbohydrates and proteins consumed by herbivores and ruminants. So agriculture is a source and a sink of greenhouse gases. It's really important to know that. The removal of atmospheric CO2 into soils is known as carbon sequestration, and it actually resulted in a net greenhouse gas emission decline between the early 80s, when the soil was more of a source, the soils were more of a source, and 2011 here in this research, when soils were a sink. So this decline is evident in the prairies, especially after the use and the adoption of beneficial management practices, like reduced tillage, decreased summer fallow, more perennial cropping instead of annual. And these practices really minimized soil disturbances and allowed carbon to accumulate naturally in the organic matter in the soil instead of being released into the atmosphere. And this figure shows that net emissions per hectare are generally higher in the on the east side of the country compared to the west or the prairies, mainly because of these best management practices having been adopted. And also because the climate is different on the east. There's a wetter climate, and so that means higher emissions of nitrous oxide, especially because more is applied with crops such as corn, more demanding in nitrogen fertilizer. So every agricultural product emits greenhouse gases as a result of its production, and there's a variability among sectors, among subsectors in their carbon footprint. And so we need to account for every process that takes place in every production system. And so this figure shows the intensity for a variety of subsectors, and you can see the different colors of different years. And there's a decline. You can see a decrease between the early 80s and the mid 2000s, especially for beef and pork. And this is mainly as a result of improved management practices, better crop yields, and more productive livestock breeds as well. So yeah, these estimates did not include the change in soil carbon. So here's an interesting way of looking at things. Because different subsectors or different production systems are difficult to compare. So you have different products, you have beef, pork, dairy, poultry, and different production systems. So using a common denominator helps compare the systems. So using protein in this case as a common denominator created comparable measurements for each livestock commodity. And the researchers that coined this were Dyer and Desjardins. They coined greenhouse gas protein indicator back in 2010, and this figure is from one of their publications using data from the early 2000s. So protein produced from sheep and beef produced higher greenhouse gas emissions than from other livestock commodities. And the reason for this is probably the sheep and beef have lower fecundity rates and also produce higher methane emissions during digestion than other livestock commodities. So using this indicator, the authors investigated the impact of reducing consumption of red meat or the impact of diversifying protein consumption or even changing cattle diets on greenhouse gas emissions. So it's a really cool publication. And they state that eating less meat and diversifying meat choices, consumers could significantly reduce greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture. So as consumers, we do make choices that affect market economies and greenhouse gas emissions. So if we look at crop production, this figure shows estimates for major crops. And so on the left side, we have kilograms of CO2 equivalent per hectare, and then the right side, kilograms of CO2 equivalent per kilogram of dry matter produced. So these emissions were estimated using production and fertilizer data from Statistics Canada. And the low values, you can see some of the crops like alfalfa and lentils, chickpeas require lower inputs of fertilizer than crops that have higher emission intensities like corn and potatoes. And so crops with low greenhouse gas emission intensities are usually like legumes and alfalfa, soybeans that can fix their own nitrogen and have a high soil carbon sequestration. So how can we reach net zero emissions from agriculture while ensuring sustainable economy? Knowing that we have a population that's growing globally, and so the demand for food is increasing, and the demand for higher yields, more crops, more products, and maybe more and more variety of sources of proteins as well. So having conversations such as these is really important and is a first step towards finding solutions. It's a complex set of issues and everyone's involved. And so some stakeholders may be more affected than others by changes to be made, but it's important to share thoughts and experiences. And what can be done? What makes financial sense? That's the first question to be asked. And what do farmers recommend? What is their point of view? How can we combine financial sense and carbon neutrality? And how about as a consumer, what are our options? So in order to have conversations, it's important to know that this is affecting all of us, and all stakeholders need to be a part of these conversations. So some of the solutions here, like for livestock production, we can try and capture methane for bioenergy, using it to produce energy, or lowering methane production, maybe by affecting feed quality and composition, or using additives in diets, reducing the number of microorganisms responsible for methane production. And some of them are in place, but still some work needs to be done on them. Possibly breeding for low methane cows. There are genetic differences among cows that influence methane production. And then diversifying protein options on farms and on our plates. And so for cropping systems and soil management, fewer inputs, of course. If we can use fewer fertilizers and herbicides and pesticides. Precision farming is fantastic because you apply what you need when you need in the exact location or as close as possible to just that location. Crop rotations are great because they break the cycle of pests and weeds. And then no-till, of course, keeps the carbon in place. Perennial crops and cover crops as well are part of current management systems that are working. And it's important to find solutions to marginal lands as well. And to be as cost efficient as possible on every land. And then, of course, to have a systems approach to finding a solution. So this is it for me. I'd like to pass it on to Dr. Krobel, who will look at whole farm systems approach to estimating greenhouse gas emissions.
Thank you, Ymène. I'll carry on as soon as you stop sharing.
Yes.
Perfect. All right, you should be able to see my PowerPoint now, and hopefully in a second when the computer reacts, also the presentation. Okay, so Ymène has kind of pointed at the fact that we can use consumer choice to make a choice essentially of products that have less of a footprint. But the research that I'm interested in is to look at the farm system and see what can we do on the farm. So for this, we kind of take this whole carbon footprint approach and basically look at the life cycle of a product. This is a study here on a beef production system. And so what the researcher Karen Boschman looked at was the amount of total greenhouse gas emissions that are associated with the final product, the meat. And so she looked at the whole production cycle and found that the major source of greenhouse gas emissions was enteric methane, and that 80% of the greenhouse gas emissions came from the cow-calf system as part of the cow-calf backgrounding feedlot system. because of the time and the feed quality in the cow-calf. We've done something similar, and just note that so we have 63% enteric methane, and then manure N2O makes 23%. So we did the same thing for a dairy system, and here this whole picture changed in terms of that enteric methane in the dairy carbon footprint of milk only makes roughly 50% of the footprint, and then N2O comes rather from soils and crop and makes up the 25–26%. And so this is basically the difference that it makes, because in dairy production we have a much higher rate of growing the feed in a fertilized system. Therefore, fertilizer gets applied and N2O ensues from the soil. While in a grazing situation, we don't fertilize, and so therefore we have less soil N2O. So this is important to understand in such a production cycle, where are how much emissions coming from and what type of emissions. Now, there is a big difference for the farmer in the sense that what we're talking here about was the carbon footprint. So all the emissions that are associated with the creation of a product. That is not the same as the farm emissions that simply, but looks at the emissions that occur on the farm. And so may include multiple production cycles or single steps and shares. We have done these analyses, and we do this with the HOLAS model, which is a whole farm model that we built here in Lethbridge at ASC. And so we account for all the emissions that are ongoing on the farm. And we also include some upstream emissions. And so this is part of the difference, because on-farm emissions do not include the emissions associated with creating the fertilizer. But if I want to track the emissions of a product throughout this life cycle, then these emissions that are associated to creating the fertilizer are part of that budget. And so the HOLAS model accounts for that as well. But there is still a limitation there, because we do, take internationally recognized calculation methods and calculate all the greenhouse gas emissions, and we transform them into a total CO2 equivalent, which then is used basically as a per product unit. But yet the model itself is not really an LCA tool. And this is because a LCA lifecycle analysis doesn't only look at greenhouse gas emissions for starters, but then again, we need to take into account the whole production cycle. So in a beef production system, we think of the production cycle being 8 years long, because we're essentially looking at the length of reproduction. So I have a slide for this, that shows this here. So we know, so to say, when a calf grows up, it takes 2 years to get to maturity, when then it starts calving. And it will have, on average, in its lifetime, 6 calves. So for each of these calves, if we calculate the greenhouse gas footprint, so to say, the mother cow basically has to be incorporated, because the mother cow is still around. And so this is basically the part of where things get really complex, where we need to account for a whole lot of complicated things. To then come to the question, well, what is the potential then to reduce emissions? So in a rumen, we do have the feed that goes in, it goes through an anaerobic fermentation, and the cow derives from that energy and protein. But the process of anaerobic fermentation creates hydrogen ions, and methanogenic bacteria connect carbon to this hydrogen in order for the cow essentially to get rid of it. Because if that hydrogen sticked around in the rumen, the cow would probably eventually go boom, and we don't want that. So in this sense, the methanogens are a lifesaver. What we can do is add or change the feed quality, because the feed quality determines how long this feed stays in the anaerobic fermentation chamber. Higher quality quicker passing rate, and therefore less methane. The other option is that we add in additives like fat, nitrooxypropanol, or seaweed, which do have a potential to capture these hydrogen ions, and so therefore basically bypass the methanogens and therefore reduce the amount of methane that goes in. Going on to nitrous oxide, and Ymène has already stolen my thunder a little bit, but just to reiterate, with nitrogen, we're talking about the nitrogen cycle. And you see on the top there, the N2, that's your atmospheric nitrogen, which is really unresponsive because it's a strong chemical bind, and so it doesn't really do anything but just stay there. What we do is we spend a lot of energy to break that N2 bond up and make nitrogen fertilizer out of it. And so we feed this in usually or quite frequently as urea, so as an ammonium fertilizer. And when we apply ammonium to the soil, then we always have a risk that some of that ammonium is volatilized as ammonia and goes back into the atmosphere and bounces off. The remaining nitrogen is used by the crop that's growing, by small carbon microbials that snatch up this nitrogen. But what the reactive nitrogen does is it always will run through this nitrogen cycle. You can see there's multiple pathways of exit, but invariably you will end up eventually at the stage that is N2O. And some of that N2O will leave the soil and come back to the atmosphere. The cycle, I basically displayed it here as a one-directional cycle. This is not entirely true. On the bottom half, the nitrogen can bounce forth and back, and so therefore pass through this N2O stage multiple times, in fact. So what can we do? Well, the easiest way to prevent N2O is basically reduction of inputs. Ideally, we would apply the fertilizer, and all the N that we put into the soil is taken up by the crop, and there is no nitrogen left over for nitrous oxide emissions. That's hard to achieve. There is a number of 4R nutrient management strategies that are recommended to increase the utilization of nitrogen by the crop, which then theoretically will have an effect on the nitrous oxide emission factors. This is research that is ongoing, and we don't really have a consequential result yet in terms of what the actual reductions are. So there is cases where it's been shown to reduce N2O. We just don't know whether it's a universal reduction that we can apply across the land. Another option that is being researched is the question of inhibitors. And so there we have nitrification and urease inhibitors. Here the thing is that research has shown so far that the nitrous oxide reduction only takes place if you actually apply both of the inhibitors. So the urease inhibitor basically prevents ammonium from being volatilized as ammonia, and the nitrification inhibitor prevents the nitrogen, so to say, to be progressing through the whole nitrification to nitrate and then subsequently to nitrous oxide. So if we only apply the urease, then we have basically more nitrogen that can be nitrified, while if we only inhibit the nitrification, then we still have this ammonia loss. The last option then is CO2 emissions. And again, CO2, we can basically reduce inputs because the nitrogen fertilizer is basically made and produced by using a lot of natural gas, which is fossil CO2. So using less nitrogen fertilizer therefore reduces nitrous oxide as well as CO2 emissions. Another option is the avoidance of combustion engines, and I don't think there is much going on yet in terms of development on battery-driven tractors, but hopefully this will change soon. Alternative options then for the farmer is renewable energy generation, to say, well, I replace electricity that, for instance, in Alberta comes half and half from coal power plants and natural gas plants, which also have a CO2 footprint. and I use solar or wind instead, so I don't get that CO2 footprint. And if I feed it back into the grid because I have a surplus, then I offset other people's CO2 emissions. And a similar principle of that is basically then soil carbon gains, and Ymène alluded on that, that if we store carbon in the soil and increase the soil carbon storage, we actively take carbon from the atmosphere, pull it out and put it into the soil. To then get to the carbon footprint, as I said, we talk basically about like the total greenhouse gas emissions associated with a product. And so in the science world, we talk about greenhouse gas intensity or greenhouse gas efficiency. But what this ultimately means is that we recalculate all emissions of nitrous oxide, methane, CO2 into CO2 equivalents. Ymène said already that there's like a changing numbers, and I've given you there the development, say, of the conversion numbers of the global warming potentials published by IPCC. Here the thing is that the global warming potentials are calculated as of the current state of radiative forcing that each greenhouse gas has. And so we can nicely see this with methane, that the global warming potential increases as both the CO2 emissions or the concentrations increased, as well as the methane emissions or concentrations increased as well. With the N2O, it's actually a bit more complicated because there was also a bit of updating the methodology. And so this is why you see the numbers going up and down. Challenges. The big trouble is, for instance, with enteric methane, I've showed you in the beginning that most comes from the cow-calf, and then we found these quite effective additives that we can feed. But in order to apply these additives, that's actually easiest done in a feedlot where we basically control the feeding. So question is, can we find a way how we can provide such additives in a reliable manner in a grazing situation? That's research that has still to be done. Then the question is, even if the farmers do adopt these practices to reduce emissions, how do we actually account for that? The national inventory is a way where Canada reports on the emissions that we have in Canada. And so knowing about the farm practices adoption would be a necessary information, but we need to develop basically collection practices for such farm practices adoption. In terms of machinery change on the farm system, we know that farm machinery is quite pricey, and so it's a long-term investment for the farmers. And so if we require them to basically switch to a fossil-free machinery, we need to talk about like who will foot the bill for this switch. And ultimately, there's also the question with respect to the emissions in itself. An argument could be made that agricultural methane emissions should be accounted for differently than fossil methane emissions, because in the case of fossil, it's that methane will become CO2, and it will ultimately be a CO2 addition because that methane came from underground. While agricultural methane emissions is actually CO2 that was captured from the atmosphere first, then it will have a warming effect as the methane, but then it will return to be CO2 that was there previously. So if you want to hear more and me talk about the HOLAS model and what we do with the model, please be in touch. And other than that, I hand over to Margot.
Thank you. Great, thank you, Roland and Ymène, for the great presentation. So I'm going to pick it up from here, speaking in relation to policy and decarbonization of agriculture. So both Ymène and Roland have done some great work on talking about the practices in relation to reducing greenhouse gases in agricultural management. So very much focusing in on the farmer level. So I'll speak a bit to the farmer level, but perhaps a bit to the farm food level, and as well as the international level. So I was looking at the prairie provinces in particular, and Canada as well. So agriculture is both a provincial and a federal matter. And for that reason, there's certain commonalities between the provinces, but there's also certain differences because of the provincial influence. So in Alberta, there is a levy on farm fuel, there is a carbon offset market, which allows producers who increase efficiency and reduce emissions to actually earn extra income. And they've approved 4 protocols that create these carbon offsets, including conservation cropping, how they feed their cattle, the microgeneration of renewable energy, which was touched on by Ymène, and biogas production. And in Saskatchewan, what our policy looks like is in relation to the climate resilience measurement framework. And an important component of this is the 4R nutrients. This is the fertilizer policy that Roland was speaking to. And the measure that Saskatchewan is tracking is the percentage of farm land that's under this 4R nutrient stewardship plan. The total amount of protected areas in Saskatchewan. And then of course in Saskatchewan, we have the federal carbon tax and output-based pricing systems for large emitters, which to date are not yet agricultural producers. Manitoba has the federal carbon tax as well, and has a Manitoba Sustainable Agricultural Practices Program, an Environmental Farm Action Program, and a riparian tax credit, which is to incent the retention of riparian areas. And the reason that I'm mentioning this is not only is keeping carbon in soil important, but it's also very important to think about water in soil. So the drier our soil gets, the less carbon that it's holding. The more wetlands that we have, the more carbon we're storing in land. So just some thoughts around carbon pricing. When I did a similar presentation last year, there was a big diversity on what carbon pricing is. But what you see here is with the federal government carbon pricing, we're coming to have similar carbon pricing in the prairie provinces. So the agricultural sector has been subject to certain carbon pricing initiatives in the past, as I've pointed out, but there hasn't been a really concerted effort to consider the entire system of agriculture, both at the farm level, but as well as the food supply chain in respect of greenhouse gas emissions reductions. So nothing really comprehensive as yet, but there's been some great developments. The EU has an agricultural policy that was striving to measure greenhouse gas carbon offsets and incent more conservation, more measures. Switzerland, Republic of Korea. So there are examples to draw on. And one of the countries that's most advanced in thinking about this is New Zealand, because they have such an incredibly large component of agriculture in their GDP. But when we think of emission trading systems in the context of agriculture, there are some concerns that we need to think about. And one is food prices and what that is going to do in relation to social equity for our producers and for our industry of agriculture. There's worry about carbon leakage or border adjustments. So if we're taxing and pricing carbon, whether through emissions trading or a carbon tax, is there an adjustment that we can make to inputs coming or imports coming into Canada that aren't as highly priced? And what does it do to our international sales of our farm produce when the price that our agricultural producers are having to pay is increased because of this? So where should carbon pricing and emission trading systems, where should we think about having them? Should they be at the farm level, which is something that we've been focusing on here in this presentation, but should we be talking about another system, the processor level, the food, the bread, the different areas in that whole food supply chain? And so there's a lot we actually don't know in this area because we haven't done the economic studies and we haven't pursued this area in agriculture a lot. So I'm going to move back into the farm level for a bit. The agricultural best management practices are provincial programs that are like carrots to incent farmers on the ground to have better stewardship first of their land, but are also coincidentally incenting farmers to retain that carbon in their soil. So Saskatchewan has these incentives. Manitoba also has a similar best management practice, and they have some very specific provisions around climate change adaptation and mitigation for co-benefits, for life cycle assessments on their entire farm system. Somewhat like Roland was speaking about, HOLIS would be something where they can use solar panels, bioethanol, and wheat and canola. So the entire system is being considered in their best management practices. And Alberta, I mentioned as well, has this farming for land stewardship program for soil quality and minimizing nutrient loss. So is there a way that we can learn from one another's best management practices here on the prairies? And is there a way that we can ensure that these BMPs that are helping and assisting this behavior are complete as they could or should be? So I'm going to mention too that these policies are very consistent with some of the land and climate change findings around practices and policies when the global literature around agriculture and policies were surveyed. So we know that policies that are not only addressing the mitigation of greenhouse gases, but they're also actually assisting agricultural producers in the industry to adapt to the changes of climate change. And in that same way, they're also reducing desertification of our farmland or degradation of our farmland, and also advancing food security. So many of the policies and practices that Ymène and Roland have talked about are hitting all of these checks. So increased food productivity, better efficiency, you can see at the very top, is improving greenhouse gas mitigation, adaptation, reducing desertification, land degradation, and advancing food security. So agroforestry, something we probably don't think about a lot in Canada, is an idea that is also advancing all of these. I won't run through this entire list. It's in the Land and Climate Report, Chapter 6. But notice the red. So reducing grassland conversion to cropland is good for mitigation, but it may have food security implications. And I think in the prairies, we actually have a lot of learning and history in relation to this particular topic that we could document and continue to think about in the importance of our beef industry and what's happening with greenhouse gas emissions. And then at the very bottom, I'll mention the other red highlight. Notice restoration and reduced conversion of peatlands. So this is something very near and dear to Saskatchewan in our northern communities, where the mining of peatlands is something that's being considered. And note that, again, somewhat good for mitigation because of the use of this peatland, but then food security is reduced for the hunting, trapping, and fishing and traditional indigenous lifestyles that are happening in this land. There are important international developments happening that are also somewhat carrots for us to think about this in the agricultural industry. And these are standards and certifications that are being developed by purchasers of agricultural commodities. So again, in Chapter 7 of the Land and Climate Report, we put together just a smattering of some of these certification for the production of agricultural goods and what they were measuring in relation to sustainability. So I won't go through each and every one of these, but I actually was looking several months ago at a canola certification. And interestingly, part of the certification for this sustainable canola that the Europeans wanted to see is a guarantee that in the production of the canola and the farm gate, there was actually no reduction in wetlands on that farm in order to secure that production. So purchasers are starting to ask for deep and quite specific questions of our agricultural communities. And there's a business risk if we don't start as a community thinking about some of these issues. Roland mentioned, and Ymène as well, changing diets, so I won't talk about that. That was one of the major findings coming from the Land and Climate Report. But another major finding that I will mention is the fact that about 25 to 30% of our food system emissions are actually lost through us throwing our food out because we don't eat it. So reducing food loss and waste here in Canada and all around the world actually makes a really substantive contribution to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So just as a summary, carbon taxes are very effective and low cost. And I see John Wright is on our list, and I'm pretty sure he would agree with me. Cap and trade systems can be more cost effective, and our agricultural system is already being exposed to this carbon pricing. So it's a really important topic to keep in the forefront and think about, because there's sales risks that could happen if we don't keep this question in mind. So I have some questions, but I would really like to hear from the audience if there's any questions.
Margot, Roland, and Ymène, thank you all very much. Very thought-provoking, and we have questions already appearing in the chat. So thought-provoking stuff, although Roland, I have to tell you, it's going to take me a while to get that image of the exploding cow out of my mind. So that might be one of the things that remains with us. I'll flip over to the chat right away, but I'll just maybe use my moderator's prerogative to post the first question as I sort some of the things out on the chat. So to all three of you, agriculture is an industry where producers have very little control, or essentially no control, over the price they get for their product. So can you link that to the argument for having agriculture account for GHG emissions? If you could comment on that as I look at the questions in the chat. Thank you.
I feel like Margot should go first with that one.
I saw Ymène took her microphone off. Did you want to go? Or I can. I think that's exactly a point I was trying to make. Is we all know that agricultural, the sale price for most agricultural products are externally determined, and agricultural producers can manage their costs. So they're always in a really risky occupation. But the reality is, around the world, the pricing of carbon and greenhouse gas emissions in agriculture is occurring. So the border linkage and the adjustments that are maybe happening at the border will be really important. So to me, this is a bit of an important issue if Canada and agricultural producers in Canada are going to maintain their international sales, because the rest of the world, the purchasers are looking at greenhouse gases in agriculture now and accounting for it in the certification schemes. So it's not something that we want to not, as marketers, have thought of long and hard. And the federal government, as we know, is coming down with the costs of carbon, which for all intents and purposes, there's some agricultural exemptions in some of the provinces, but it will drive what Roland was referring to. It'll drive innovation, and it should drive innovation in the farm machinery, in the tractors, the equipment, moving into different types of fuels, and perhaps even into hydrogen powered or battery powered equipment. And that's exactly the type of innovation policy that we'll need, that will make things more efficient, reduce costs as carbon and gasoline prices go up, and keep agricultural producers competitive. Ymène, Roland?
I'm going to switch this around and say, well, yes, you don't have control over the price, but you do have some control over the cost. And so a nitrogen fertilizer that you apply is actual money that you have to spend. And if your fertilizer use efficiency is only 50%, then basically what you do is take half of that fertilizer you just paid for and throw it out of the window. Part of that 50% will be nitrous oxide emissions. So if we can show you ways to reduce your nitrous oxide emissions, as I said, because it's all interconnected, there's a good chance that we also save you some of the other fertilizer losses. And so therefore, reducing greenhouse gas emissions actually saves you money. It's similar with enteric methane in terms of, I've told you that we take carbon to basically make your hydrogen ions not dangerous. But this is carbon that your cow would otherwise take up, build cell material from it, burn it, and move around from. So again, you have a loss of a resource that actually turns out to be a greenhouse gas product. So part of the research that went on with NOP, where basically they tried to block this pathway and deal with this hydrogen in a different way, actually did mean, I don't have the exact numbers, but it resulted in a somewhat higher productivity of the animal because there was more carbon out of this forage available for growth.
Yeah, I agree with both what you've said, and I think because it's a system that encompasses, you know, from producers to, you know, the market economy, and it's the whole food system, and then the consumers also. So even though producers might not have a direct impact on the price, we all, in a sense, have an indirect effect on the market economy by the way we live and the choices we make. And so, yeah, I think if we look at everything that we do and the ways we can contribute, whether we have a farm and are able to work directly on our production system or not, there are choices we can make to decrease our emissions.
Thanks to all of you. I think I'll maybe take the questions in order from the chat. The first one is a short one. I'm not sure it's an easy one, but a short one. And Ymène, I'll start with you because it came in during your presentation. Somebody asked the question from one of your graphs: what caused the dramatic increase of greenhouse gas emissions in 2017?
Yeah, I saw that question, and I was thinking 2017. What I would go back to look for is what was the weather doing that summer? Did we have floods? Did we have a drought? Because that would directly impact what's happening in the soil and how much sequestration is occurring, and how much leaching of nitrogen has happened. And so I'd have to go back to weather patterns that year and see it. And I don't know if there were wildfires that year, so I don't have a specific answer to that year, but it could be a bunch of events that occurred that summer.
Man, was that a jump in the actual like kilograms of nitrous oxide, or was it a jump in the CO2 equivalents?
I think it's from the graph where I was showing an increase from 45 megatons to 59 megatons over from 1990 to 2018.
Because 2017 would be probably the year where the NIR updated the global warming potential from the 2015 IPCC. And
so
this,
it could also be a calculation, like increase through the methodology change.
Okay, good, thanks. So it might be weather, it might be data collection, we're not sure. Thanks though for the question. Knut poses a question. Roland, this came in during your presentation, so I'll go to you first. I'm curious as to if the GHG emission per kilogram of protein produced chart includes processing related emissions, or if this chart was based purely on growing the livestock, and how much processes like shipping and cold storage impact per kilogram of protein emission.
This may actually be a question going back to Ymène, one of her last slides there. In our case, we only, and this is basically my employer, I'm with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, so we look at agriculture production and that's where it stops. Also with respect to that, we think the farm system is actually the bigger unknown and the place where you can do more about it actually. But the numbers that I showed is basically cradle to farm gate. So at the moment it leaves the farm gate, we stop counting.
Thank you. Margot or Ymène, any other comments on that? No. Next question from Michael. Are there misconceptions by consumers as to what are the best choices? No hormone beef and grass-fed beef, not that we're talking about any particular fast food outlet here. No hormone beef and grass-fed beef actually have higher GHG emissions. Is there a danger that marketing and public perception push consumers in a counterproductive direction with respect to greenhouse gases?
I can make a start on that. So yes, in terms of if you purely approach this from the greenhouse gas side, then the result is fairly clear. But as I also pointed out with the life cycle analysis, there's a lot more things that we can look at. And so I do agree with the fact that ideally we would have more educated consumer that make an educated choice about to say, well, we want a product that I know protected wildlife and biodiversity, or I want a product that is as low a carbon footprint as possible.
I agree. I think nowadays we're seeing a lot more interest on the consumer side about what is being consumed, is being purchased, and so I have faith that there's going to be more questions asked and not just believing, you know, the marketing schemes, or you know, just asking more questions. And that's the point of this conversation, really, is to put everything on the table and you know, be open about all kinds of questions that people might, and concerns people might have. And
just to follow on the technical experts you just heard from, but in my thinking, I'm always questioning, well, what went into the model to determine this accounting for greenhouse gas emissions? So I learned so much just from Roland's presentation about the cow-calf, because I always thought it was the last process in the feedlots where the cattle industry's greenhouse gas emissions, the carbon intake from the intensive feeding in the intensive livestock corrals where carbon increased. So just having the discussions and knowing the differences between like dairy industry and then growing beef for protein is really fascinating to me. And I'm not sure that the industry, the agricultural industry or the farm producers are actually, are they even aware of this really important science information around greenhouse gases? And do the marketing arms of the beef producers, do they know it, and are they able to talk about? So from my perspective, there's a deficit of knowledge amongst many of the actors, and there's also missed opportunity for getting really good news stories out about, say, our beef in relation to beef production in other areas of the world and its greenhouse gas intensity. So I have way more questions than I ever thought I would have in relation to this topic. And just to throw another aspect in, where are we getting our food? So if I'm eating apples that came from Chile versus apples that came from British Columbia, the accounting for the transport of that food, I'm not certain that we've taken that into account in any of our modeling or any of the information that we're giving to the public.
Just to make the discussion a bit more complicated. So we do know that grass-fed beef in Canada has one of the lowest carbon footprints worldwide. What we also want to think about is, well, if we hadn't the beef, what would be there instead? So I can basically take that grassland that I'm right now using for beef, and I'm pointed at the question of biodiversity and habitat, and turn this into cropland. Now, if I do grow crops there, I will fertilize them and I will have nitrous oxide emissions instead. And so this is also a balance where we need to think about, like, as Canadians in total, like, what is the land use that we prefer? It's a value question. I can make a suggestion to that, because, like, I'm a scientist and that's my function. So this conversation has to be carried on to think about, how do we want our landscape to look like?
Good. Thanks to all three of you. There's a comment. Karen points out it's a comment, not so much a question, but I'll ask each of you if you would like to comment on her comment. Some of the efforts to increase yields and concentrate production could be combined with increasing riparian land base. This would potentially support higher use of fertilizers, GMO, to get best crop strains, very complex. Any comments that you might have? Roland, it relates a little bit back to what you were just saying, that it's the questions go on and on and on. Anything further?
It's certainly, it is also an option. And I've seen the other comment there that said, like, well, why are we talking about this high input agriculture and not the low input one? It's a choice that farmers have to make, and it's also a choice that consumers have to make in the processing industry and the policymakers. In terms of just the general example, if I have a higher demanding crop and I supply it with more nitrogen, I also increase the chance and opportunity for higher nitrous oxide emissions, because there's no guarantee that that crop will always grow to its maximum potential. And the moment it doesn't do it, there is nitrogen left over for increased emissions. Now, it's again a choice, say, we can make in a open discussion or a policy level to say, okay, we take that risk. So in order for having more naturalized areas.
Ymène, Margot, anything further on that?
Yes, I mean, I would say that encouraging natural systems, especially systems that hold organic matter like wetlands and riparian areas, are really important. At the same time, it's the land use changes that also cause releases of the carbon in the soil and increases in emissions, increases in carbon in the atmosphere. So I don't know, there's a balance that needs to occur between changing land uses too much and having land uses in place long term that sequester enough and allow the sequestration to continue in the soil and the buildup of carbon in the soil.
Yeah, and at a global level, and Roland can fix anything I say that's wrong. At a global level, the models around the socioeconomic pathways, so the modeling that's being done around climate into the future. So the future pathways, the sustainability pathway envisions a very sustainable land use practice, but it also has many assumptions of low population. But those sustainability practices, when we were putting them together in the Land and Climate Report, included going into perennial cropping. So that's not really something I think that's in an innovation manner been explored as much as it could be here in Saskatchewan. So in Sweden, when I was visiting lecture there, they actually were doing tracts of perennial wheat, and a bar was actually producing beer and alcohol from the crops that were being grown in this perennial manner. So it was local, and the perennials, although they take several years to establish, once they do get going, the yields are actually not as good, but still significant in relation to non-perennial grains. So changing our thinking, like in the local, it actually does cross over with some of the global climate models for sustainability, and the SSP1 is what it's called, which is the sustainability path we need to think about in our individual, our national, and our policies in order to achieve our objectives in the Paris Agreement of keeping global warming to less than 2 degrees Celsius.
Thank you, Margot. That comment ties in a little bit to the question we have from Andre. Your presentations seem to take for granted that we can address this problem by tinkering with the industrial ag model that is high input fossil fuel dependent. What if a more fundamental rethinking is in order? What role is there for organic ag, agroecology, and truly low-put agriculture?
I guess I can start because, and then Roland and Ymène can move in. So back to the global climate model. So socioeconomic pathway 1, the sustainability one, envisions this type of future world where we're going to have these types of practices, but it doesn't drill down into excessive detail, obviously, because it's a global climate model. But what we do know is that what I just said before, the sustainability practices are really, really important. And when we were putting together the chapter 7 of that Land and Climate Report, we were really cognizant about what those practices would look like and what kind of practices had synergies in different areas of the world. So for instance, the idea of solar panels and wind energy is great, but in solar panels, it may be taking land out of production for crops. So we really need to be thinking about the local and the local context and application, but also about the global. So the other aspect of this that I didn't speak so much to and is really pertinent to Saskatchewan is we're agricultural product exporters. So we really do feed the world. And in our trajectories of climate change, where some areas of the world are going to have a harder and harder time producing food, then places like Canada have a bigger and bigger obligation in relation to food production. So it's really a system thinking that we need to think about. But I'm gonna also go back to the idea that food security and the literature that comes around about food security in relation to most regional places is that the more food that can be produced locally and consumed locally in a relational manner, it actually improves food security in general. So thinking about that and how we can do it in our cities, how we can do it locally is really, really, I think, important. Ymène and Roland?
Yeah, I would add that it's important to encourage small farms as well as sustainability of large farms, because as you say, if we're going to be local and more efficient, I guess you can start small, and it's easier when you're a smaller farm and then go organic, and then I guess become larger over time if that's an option and if that works. But in order to stay sustainable, it's organic is a great way to go. And we'll see that the thing is going to be how to change from the current situation if you already have a large cow-calf operation and yes, want to switch a production system. I don't know, that might be a harder thing to think about, to accomplish. So yeah, lots of questions there.
Yeah, and well, actually, my bachelor degree is in organic farming, so I think I understand where you're coming from. And in terms of basically just the viewpoint of greenhouse gas emissions, I think, as I pointed out, there's a lower inputs certainly reduce the risk of greenhouse gas emissions, but don't necessarily eliminate them. The reason my personal interest in organic systems is because those systems are usually more interconnected. There is an intent to reutilize, there is an intent to be more diverse and be more respectful of the native systems, to provide habitat to natural predators and pesticides, if you want. But, and this is kind of the official hat where I need to carefully tiptoe, the majority of Canadian agriculture is this high input agriculture. And I think one of the roles that we of AOC play is to figure out how can we point the way for those systems to also be more carbon neutral. But regardless of that, AFC does have an organic science cluster. AFC also has the Living Labs program, where things, where research is taking place that is farmer induced and where regenerative practices are investigated.
See, this is where it would be perfect to have organic farmers here chatting with us and speaking on their experiences, as well as you know, all kinds of different operating systems, you know, production systems, I guess.
From the looks of the chat, we certainly have a diversity of interest in our crowd, which is wonderful. Margot, starting with you, you mentioned wetlands. There's a couple of questions in here about water and wetlands, actually. You mentioned the wetlands are carbon sinks, but in the review of sources from agriculture, the ongoing drainage of wetlands across the prairies was not mentioned. Are there thoughts or discussions to include or account for wetlands in the decarbonizing agriculture discussion or calculations? I'll go to you first, Margot, because you did allude to that in your presentation.
I would really love for that to be included. There's some excellent work going on at the University of Regina by Carrie Finlay about dugouts, and confirming that dugouts are actually carbon sinks until they reach a certain point where they may not be. But she's also balanced that with using dugout water to water cattle. And where the sweet spot is, because dugouts to be a carbon sink have to have a lot of green algae material in them, but you don't want too much because that might harm cattle if it crosses a certain point. So she's got this really great research about carbon sinks in dugouts, but also being good sources of water for cows. Anyway, so I'm just giving a push for her. So back to wetlands. So we do know this, but I think we need a lot more science. And this kind of leads to something I think we're all dancing around, is we really don't have the accounting, verification, and reporting systems that we would like. And then the question arises, well, who should be doing the accounting, verification, and reporting? And I'm sure we all might agree that it's perhaps not something that either a federal or a provincial government would want to do at the farm gate, a regulatory way of managing greenhouse gas emissions in agriculture. So I've been really fascinated by some of the tech, the applications that are now existent for agricultural producers. They're precision farming. They are so tech savvy. And I've been asking these vendors of these precision applications if they can calculate greenhouse gases in these practices, and if they do that. And I haven't found one that does yet. So I think there's not only, there's a gap and I don't think it's a gap necessarily that government should fill, but it's a gap that's at some points with our international obligations and we have a fourth working group at the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that does this. But at an international level, obviously Canada does this when it files its NDCs with the UNFCCC. But then to actually do it on the individual level, or to do it when I'm at the grocery store, I can know how much greenhouse gas, how much carbon is on my plate. That is the accounting verification reporting systems that we, in an innovation manner, in a conciliatory, in a cooperative manner, in a scientific manner, that I would like to see a conversation around.
Roland?
I can actually say something to this because yeah, we're collaborating right now in 2 projects to try and figure out how we can add a wetland component to the HOLAS model. And so this is with respect to greenhouse gas emissions and carbon storage, but also with the understanding that most wetlands that are degraded are actually in cropping systems. The most still intact wetlands are actually on pastures. And in some cases, we actually don't really know where these wetlands were or where they should be. There is research out there that basically says, well, like trying to crop your wetland is actually a waste of money because you provide a lot of inputs and you never get the yield out to recover that. So you should be better off not to try and crop this. But this is a different point to make than to figure out, okay, if I have a wetland that is degraded, what can I actually do with it? And so this is where we're trying to focus our research, and we collaborate on that respect with Ducks Unlimited and the University of Saskatchewan to try and Angela Bedard-Horn is trying to map actually where wetland used to be, and then others basically do this research into like, can we, as a colleague of mine, Fardowsi Akhtar at Indian Head, who is looking at, can we plant willow around this wetland area to basically rejuvenate or renaturalize it? So there is basically then kind of the question for the farmer. So if I don't want to plow over or crop over my wetland, what can I do with it? And to provide pathways how to manage this wetland to achieve certain benefits in terms of greenhouse gas emissions or carbon sequestration, or simply as a habitat that allows me to reduce my pesticide application because it houses predators that take care of the crop pests that I have on the land. In terms of accounting for it, this may actually not be that tricky in terms of, once we know from the soil topography where the wetlands should be, you can use satellite images to identify in what naturalization state a wetland is in. And so it's a lot of work to do it, but there is, so to say, a technical pathway where you could account for that, I think.
Great, thank you. I'm going to use the moderator's prerogative because I'm conscious of the time and skip over the next question because it's from someone who had a question previously. So in order to give as many people as possible an opportunity, I'll just very quickly point out a comment from Karen. There has been a Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Beef for a number of years. They produced GHG emission studies for our Canadian brief. And then there's a question about water quality, and I'm actually going to take the next 2 questions and pose them both at the same time because they both deal with water. I wonder about, from Francis, I wonder about earlier work in Canada that has focused on water quality, nitrogen and phosphorus. Do you think there is capacity for this to further feed into the work on agricultural emissions and agricultural systems? And then Forrest asks the questions, and there may be some overlap here. Is there a significant impact anticipated from irrigation expansion? So I'll pose both those questions at once to you, panel, and then we'll see if we have time for one more after that, but I doubt it.
I can take a start at this with respect to AFC. I mentioned the living labs. They are actually focusing on water quality, so they're located in places of water quality issues and trying to continue to work on what management practices actually lower the input. With that respect to the irrigation expansion, it will have a significant impact on the overall household of water in the watershed. No doubt about that. You're basically transporting water off the stream, you put it on the land. But what will the impact be? Well, if you irrigate your crops, you do enable higher yields if you are in a water limited situation, which you are in the southern prairies. There's no doubt about this. So your crop will be able to grow less limited. It'll make probably better use of the fertilizer that you supply to it, and it will also be able to deal better with heat stress because it can transpire the water off to cool itself down. Through that, I would anticipate that your soil carbon goes up because more biomass means more carbon inputs into the ground.
Yes, I would say the effects on greenhouse gases affect. There's a connection with water quality. As I was doing some of the research in Saskatchewan on the WEBS project, the watershed evaluation of beneficial management practices. So as we change our management practices, we impact the quality of the water that moves downstream and affects rivers and lakes, and then causes or doesn't cause eutrophication. And yes, affecting the whole aquatic system. So looking at how much manure is applied, when is it applied, in relation to freeze-thaw cycles as well. So weather patterns impact the form of water from solid to liquid, and then the landforms affect where it goes, and then of course infiltration rates and porosity affect how much is drained through and left or lost, as opposed to taken up by the plant when the weather is warm enough for the plant to take it up. So yes, there's everything's related, really, a direct or indirect relationship between what practices we do with the land and what happens to the water and its quality. And then, of course, having pastures with or dugouts with areas that can collect the water that allows the nutrients to be taken up by the ecological system within the wetland, and becomes a part of that system as opposed to being lost through leaching or land, surface land loss.
And I'll just add a few points to that very interesting question and then answers. In the Land and Climate Report and the AR6 that's coming out, we're really conscious that if we change practices in one location, we actually influence its climate. So by having more water through irrigation or in the air, it actually reduces temperature. So this sounds really great, but water is a finite cycle. So it means we're taking it from somewhere else. So we need to think in the systems approach. If we've taken water from somewhere else, have we impacted the soil in that area where now there's less water? And in the same vein, if we've taken it from somewhere else, have we made another area more arid or desertified or hotter because of this relationship in our regional climate models? I'll leave it there.
Thank you. There's just one question left in the chat. And so Brenemir, my apologies. I don't think we're going to get to that, but we try very hard to stick to our timeframes for these sessions so people can do their planning. So I have the very pleasant task now of, first of all, thanking our panelists. I want to thank you for the quality of the presentations, but on behalf of the group, I also want to thank you for the length of your initial presentations, because you left us lots of time for great discussion and questions. So thank you very much for that. And on behalf of the panelists, I want to thank everyone else who's here today for the quality of your questions. It led to some really good discussion and debate, I think. So thank you all very much. I'm going to end with a very short infomercial. if you like today, we got a deal for you. We have a couple of other sessions coming up that you might be interested in, not related to the same topic, but on March 24th, the Canadian Centre for the Study of Cooperatives is hosting Elvie Del Bianco from Van City, speaking on the topic Coordinative Cooperative Development and Capacity Building in British Columbia. And you can go to the JGS site to look at that. And then one of the big events that we host every year is the Tansley Lecture on April 8th in the evening, featuring Stephanie Kelton this year. Professor Kelton will be speaking to the topic of the deficit myth, modern monetary theory, and the birth of the people's economy. So again, you can find the details about that on our events calendar. Many of you are doing this already, but I would invite you to show your appreciation in the by using the reactions in the function in the chat option. And thank you very much, everyone. Have a good day. Enjoy the weather. Stay safe and take care.
Thanks,
Thanks
Kevin.
for tuning in.
Thanks, Roland, Ymène, Karen.